Welcome to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, a podcast about geek culture by lawyers, with your hosts, Ben Siders and Kirk Damon. Today's episode is brought to you by Felix & Son Home Improvement Services, serving the residents of Niceland since 1982. If you've got a problem, we can fix it.
And welcome back, everybody, to A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, episode 22. It's hard to believe it's been that many of A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, with your host, Ben Siders. That's me, and the other guy is, as always, Kirk Damon.
That's Kirk, as in the captain of the Enterprise.
So, Kirk, Infinity War, did you see it yet?
No.
Yeah, my son texted me on my way into work this morning, and it was just an all-capital letters text that said, "I saw Infinity War." And followed up by, "It was insane."
Okay.
So, which I think we probably could have guessed.
Yeah. I mean, it's, I think the one prediction is that Infinity War is probably going to be an amazing movie.
Yes, yes. And do you have any other predictions? I mean, I've got one I have in our notes here. So Captain Marvel movie's coming out with Brie Larson. I was looking at the release schedule, and that's coming out, I think, next spring, like February, March, sometime around in there.
Okay.
And then there's what I assume is a follow-up to this Infinity War, a second Infinity War movie coming out shortly after that. So my hunch is that they're going to do a Black Panther type thing where they release the highly anticipated, very unusual comic book movie introducing a new hero, and then we're all excited about it, so we see that hero again a month later in a new movie.
One would presume so, yes. I think that's a sort of safe assumption.
So if they're going to do that, so my one prediction for Infinity War is the post-credit scene that Marvel always does somehow has like a Brie Larson cameo as Captain Marvel.
Yeah, I can see that. I mean, I think there's going to be an after-credit scene. Like, there's no question about that. They just always do it. And so I think the key question is just what is going to introduce. Yeah. I have to wonder if maybe, quite frankly, the post-credit scene, it might not even necessarily reference another movie, but it might actually reference something which is going to happen in the second movie.
Yeah.
Or potentially contradict something that happens in the first. I mean, there's been rumors somebody dies in the first movie. So
I would assume lots of people die. You got to thin that cast out.
Yeah.
My guess is I think we could probably get a clue by just looking at which ones of these superheroes have more movies coming out. Like there's a Guardians of the Galaxy 3, so somebody has to survive, from those movies to make that movie, or unless I guess it's a prequel, I don't know, but there's lots that could happen there. We've also been asked why we haven't talked about the Han Solo movie yet for being a bunch of Star Wars geeks.
Yeah, well, I think the issue with that is because they haven't really promoted it that much. I mean, surprisingly, compared to most Star Wars movies, we've seen only, I think, 2 trailers total.
There was the teaser trailer for the Super Bowl, and then the more full trailer that came out a month ago, maybe 3 weeks ago.
Something along those lines, yeah.
I got to say the teaser trailer didn't do much for me, but then I got to see, Danny Glover's son, right? Yeah. Donnie Glover plays Lando.
Yeah,
he is Lando.
That's a perfect
I want to see
casting.
it just for him. Yeah, I love the line where he says everything you've heard about me is true. Like the way he says it, like the syncopation and his delivery is just terrific. So I want to see it for that alone.
I think the thing with Solo, and I think a lot of the issue with it is that with having the regular release Star Wars movies now, there isn't quite as much hype on them. I think that's the thing that we're seeing. And this being an off release, it's not the next one in the series.
It's weird timing too, right? Because like Rogue One came out halfway between episode 7's release and episode 8's release, and then this one's in May, which I wasn't expecting it until Christmas time.
It's going to be early, and I think that's the other thing with it. The thing I think is going to be interesting about it is I'm really wondering how much of a crossover we're going to see with Fast and the Furious. I really get the impression that like Han Solo's a street racer.
Yeah, well, he says like used to been running scams, and I'm a driver and I'm a flyer and all that kind of stuff. I also saw just yesterday I saw randomly on the web. So the actor that plays Han Solo in this said that he was asked to sign on for 2 more movies. Like they're going to do a whole trilogy of just like Han Solo prequels.
That's interesting. Okay.
Yeah, I'm not sure that there's enough meat to those bones to make that work.
Well, presumably they must have liked the way this movie turned out. Then, if they want to say,
I guess, but like
more.
the production has like the rumor is it's just been plagued with problems. They had to can their directors, and they brought in Ron Howard, and they had to bring in acting coaches for a guy that plays Han Solo, who kind of looks the part, but like in the trailers, he's just kind of bland.
Yeah, he is a little bland. That's the one thing. Maybe that's part of actually the reason that we haven't been as excited about it is because he doesn't seem to have quite as much personality, at least in the teaser trailer. I think the full trailer definitely does a better job of portraying the movie.
And he probably suffers by comparison. I mean, we're asking how much charisma he has as an actor compared to Harrison Ford.
Yeah, there's kind of an issue there.
Who, as much as he's a sourpuss, he like injects his characters with this sarcastic life. So.
Yeah, and I mean, and his characters are all, they're similar. They all have a life of their own, and they have Harrison Ford written all over them.
Well, we won't go into too much detail on Han Solo because we are going to do Star Wars predictions for the Han Solo movie. We'll do that in our next episode, which I think is the last episode we'll do before the movie comes out. So we'll save that for next time.
Sounds right.
Today we're going to do something a little different compared to our usual episode format. Usually we just have one topic we canvass. So we'll cover, for example, language copyright or the time travel patent. But today it's a bit more of a blended topic. We're going to start out talking about IP rights as it pertains to buildings, and more specifically, what is called aerosol art, which is a fancy term for graffiti. And then we're going to move into how these same kinds of ideas play out with recreating fictional structures in the real world more generally, and then onto just recreating fictional things in fictional worlds more generally. And on that last point, we are going to circle back to Han Solo because we're going to talk about the Sabacc game that is being made by a company called Wren Ventures, which of course has nothing to do with Star Wars
at all. I think it's amusing that we talk about the idea of having some specific topic to canvas. I mean, our particular topic today may be canvas, as a sort of joke way to put it.
Dad joke in the house.
And the idea of what can you make on a blank canvas, and what can you then do with the canvas? But I think that's a good way to go. And it's, I guess, the way to think about what we're doing today. And when we were even designing this episode, we were looking at it and saying, these things all carry through sort of, I think, one common thread, which is the idea that you've starting off with truly sort of something that isn't necessarily blank. Mm-hmm. There is something already out there, and you're moving from what was already out there to something new. And in that case, it's a little bit like our character copyright episode.
It's kind of a common theme in a lot of what we talk about, where, like, the reason we started this podcast to some extent was people ask us constantly what they can do with all of these other properties that these companies own, because if you're not well-versed in IP and you just sort of Google this stuff and you see the decisions that come down, it kind of seems arbitrary. How come person A and B get away with doing things, but person C and D get yelled at and get in trouble for it? And there seems to be no rhyme or reason to it. And I go back to my friend Adam's comment that IP from the outside just appears to be psychotic.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's, we've said it on this program before, and I think it's one of those things. Unfortunately, I think a lot of IP law, unfortunately, looks like follow the money.
Yeah.
And, there is some argument that is the way it turns out.
But is that because of the inherent nature of IP, or because the people who have the means to enforce rights, by definition, have to have the money to enforce their rights?
I mean, there is something with that, with the idea that, in order to be able to bring a Supreme Court, IP case, it's going to cost you a lot of money. And so if it's not worthwhile to,
You've got to have a valuable enough property that it's worth the investment and the legal fees to go through the hassle and risk of trying to protect it.
Yeah.
So when someone has something small they've created that's not selling well, it doesn't get enforced because nobody cares. It's not worth enforcing.
Yep.
There's a sort of a self-selection aspect to the way our legal fee system works.
Yeah, I think that is true and what it is. But again, I think the thing that we're going to talk about today is sort of, in some sense, summing up some of these areas. It's one of these we'd talked about. We wanted to do this sort of IP in buildings for a while because it's a lot of people look at it and say, it's architecture. What does architecture have to do with intellectual property? And the answer is, well, actually, kind of a lot.
Well, and it's confusing too, even to us. I mean, architecture copyright cases don't come up that much. It's one of those things that it's out there, sort of like, vessel hull design copyrights exist, but how often do they get litigated? But it's timely because there was a recent set of decisions that involve not architecture specifically, but IP rights as applied to buildings that are sort of the kind of cases you see summarized in your Facebook feed, and they sound outrageous, but once you dig into the facts, they're really not. And so today we're going to have you, the listener, have the opportunity to make your own predictions. We're going to start out with 2 cases involving IP as applied to buildings. We're going to give you the facts, and then we're going to have you try and guess how these cases came out, and then we'll tell you how they actually came out at the end. So the first case, which you may have heard about, there's a famous group of buildings in New York known as 5 Points. It's Pointz. And in the 90s, these buildings were covered in graffiti, and the graffiti was profane and generally distasteful. And at some point, the building owners gave permission to a local graffiti artist to basically curate the structure and sort of decide who gets to put their graffiti on it and who doesn't. And I think the idea behind this probably was to reduce the amount of undesirable graffiti and increase the amount of more innocuous graffiti that just sort of looks cool but doesn't say anything horribly offensive.
Yep, and I think anybody who's lived in a big city, I think you see this. I mean, I think you see places where
there's a couple here in St. Louis. There's a couple of graffiti artists who I don't know how they do this. Like they must have spelunking equipment or rappelling equipment because you see like the tops of buildings. They have to be hanging down the outside edge to get this graffiti on there. Yep. And I have no idea what they're writing. Like the words make no sense. Yeah, but you definitely also see ones that are sort of clearly like sort of curated. You know, where it appears that they took an abandoned building, they did something purposefully with it. They just had a graffiti artist do it. You know, and some of these graffiti artists obviously become relatively famous. I mean, you know, there's local ones here that, you know, have art in art museums. Would you see on the north side of Highway 70 as you go west, there's been this old abandoned building for a long time where the doors and windows are all like broken. Somebody made giant cardboard cutouts of like gnome-like creatures and then put them in the building like they're going in and out and peeking out of the windows and made it go from ugly abandoned building to sort of interesting little work of art. Yeah, and I'm assuming that's a local graffiti artist. Unfortunately, I mean, I have no idea who it is. I mean, obviously, if one of our listeners does. Now, so someone took them down. But I've seen that logo around, and you got to wonder, was that done something as again a curated type of thing done on purpose, or was that something that he just did? So just guerrilla art. Yeah. Well, anyway, for 5 points, this curating aspect resulted in the quality of the graffiti on the building being unusually high, and over time, 5 Points became relatively famous for its high-quality aerosol art. It was selected for filming on location. If you wanted to have, a graffiti-backed building for your scene, you'd go there. I think at some point, like European graffiti artists were flown into the U.S. to add their work to it, and it became kind of an interesting, local phenomenon. But at some point, the owners of these buildings wanted to do something else with them. And demolish them and put up high-rise apartments and that sort of thing. And the graffiti artists who put their works in there over the years obviously didn't like it. At some point, they sought an injunction to have their works preserved. But they lost, and the graffiti was painted over, and the buildings were eventually knocked down. And then they filed a lawsuit under something called the Visual Artists' Rights Act of 1990, which is part of our Copyright Act. Kirk, how often do Vera lawsuits come up? Not all that much, I think is the answer, because they're primarily directed to what is called moral rights. And they're kind of these weird rights in copyright. I think we've mentioned them before. Something we don't really have in the U.S. just as a normal matter. It's a very European concept, and a lot of the reason we added them is basically to comport with international treaty, and that's part of the reason it's in the 1990, with the Berne Convention. Which has been around since the 1800s, and we've been one of the last holdouts, partially because I think we didn't want to have to add these moral rights. And one of the reasons they're tricky is because most copyright rights you can give to your employer or to a company or something, but moral rights you can't. You literally cannot transfer moral rights. It's impossible. What you end up under contract when you have contracts involving moral rights is effectively an agreement not to sue or not to assert them. Yeah, so in a normal copyright, someone hires you to write some source code, and under normal American law, as the programmer, you'd say, okay, well, I'll write it, you're going to pay me, and I agree that you, the person paying for it, get to own all the copyright rights in the source code. But you can't do that with the moral rights. You have to say, I also covenant to refrain from enforcing them. Yeah, and you literally, the copyrights, the software company in this case does own all the copyright rights. I mean, that's literally, they transferred all the copyright rights, but they can't transfer these moral rights, and they're very limited as to what they are. Yeah, the copyright rights are more commercial in nature, copy produced, the things that make money. The moral rights are things like the right of attribution, or what was relevant in this case, the right of integrity as applied to the original work. Yep. And basically what these things a lot of times are is that when you have works of certain, it's not just something that's randomly created. We talked about the fact that copyright sort of attaches automatically, but this is something that acquires some value distinction, something along those lines. Usually they're public. I was talking about this the other day, and it's, I've done it as I think they have to be public art. In some sense, I think they have to be public art because you can't acquire distinction unless it is public art. I mean, how are you ever going to get that way? So for the right of integrity to attach, the work has to be of quote-unquote recognized stature. So if there were moral rights to the Mona Lisa, I don't know if there are or not, but if there were, clearly it has recognized stature, right? But, my 4-year-old's little clay figurine that he brought home from preschool the other day, I can throw it out.
Yeah. He's not going to have moral rights in it because it's not of recognized stature. And again, I think there's a lot of this which says they have to kind of be public artworks in some respects. Not necessarily that the graffiti itself is public. You obviously have like a photograph of the graffiti.
It's
which
on
is
private
public,
property.
Which is known, something like that. Yeah, they're on private property, but obviously they're somewhat known. And again, a lot of it when we look at moral rights, what we're kind of looking at is it's sort of going back to the idea of artists' rights. And what we're really seeing in the artists' rights of this is saying, hey, look, I'm entitled to say that's my artwork.
Yeah.
And interestingly enough, we talked about previously the sort of disconnect between plagiarism and copyright. What we see in moral rights is a little bit of the idea of copyright taking in plagiarism type concepts. And really that idea that says, hey, if you can't say my work is yours, I'm entitled to say it's my work. And you kind of see that in the real copyright context with the idea of it's, okay, yeah, this person has it, I did it for them. They have the code. It's in their software. I can still say I'm the one who physically programmed it. And you can kind of see where that comes from, the ability to basically be able to market yourself as an artist, as a software programmer, as anybody who works in copyright of saying, it's mine, I did this. Yeah. Even though you can't make copies of it.
And because these moral rights are inalienable, basically, you can't get rid of them or transfer them, they stick around even if you don't own the thing that you made. So in this case, the graffiti artists in some cases jumped fences to get onto this property and paint on the building. You could debate it's with the sort of tacit permission of the owner, maybe not. I'm not sure if that issue was really ever resolved. But once they get there, they obviously don't own the building. Yeah. They presumably owned the paint they used, but there's rules that becomes part of the fixtures at that point of the building. So they don't own the original work. The building owner does. Yep. But the thing with the moral rights is the artist still has those rights, the right of integrity being a good example, even if the original copy that the right protects is no longer theirs.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing to keep in mind here is we've got that sort of intriguing issue of the moral rights attaching. The other piece of what this is, and I think it's worth keeping in mind, remember, these were somewhat curated. Yeah. So you could bump into the fact that arguably the building owner, and part of the exception with this, and I think something worth pointing out, they could potentially paint over something. They could say, hey, I think this is offensive and I'm going to paint over it, or I think this is distasteful, I'm going to paint over it. I don't know a lot about the way the 5 points work, but I would presume that actually they did paint over repeatedly, where even one artist would paint over another artist's work. So it wasn't like these were, works that were never destroyed. These things probably were regularly destroyed.
There's probably a good 4 inches of paint on the side of those buildings.
And I think that's a worthwhile thing to be thinking about, that they were destroyed on a regular basis. The other thing, when you talk about the idea like them being used in the backdrops for films, there's issues there of the idea that hey, somebody's already recreated a work. So you're talking about the copyright holder with it. Well, now it's recreated in the movie. The movie's presumably had the rights to add that as a recreation from the building owner. So you've also got it in there.
So the artist argued that the works had acquired the recognized stature that's needed based on their appearance in films and the sort of national or international repute of this development, and that when they were painted over and the building's torn down, the right of integrity was violated. The case went to a jury, and the question is, who won? Yep. And we'll answer that at the end of the show.
Yeah, you guys formulate your responses. This is your prediction episode.
Yes. Okay, so the second case is the simpler facts, but in some ways even more, alarming in my view. So the second case involves art and buildings being knocked down, but in the reverse order. And the second case was in Michigan, I think. And what happened is an architect had come up with a copyright to residential architecture, including the blueprints and the plans and the elevations and all that stuff. And then somebody else built a home that copied that architecture without permission. And what made this interesting is that the architect did not just sue for copyright infringement. He sued under a part of the Copyright Act called Section 503. And that's alarming because Section 503 is the part of the act that says that the owner of the copyright has the right to have infringing articles impounded or destroyed. Yep. So he says, I want the house knocked down.
Yep. So and I think that's the really interesting thing about this is and this is the kind of things that are hiding in the copyright laws, and quite frankly, you're hiding in statutes.
They're hiding everywhere, yeah.
That he has the right in this to come in and say, hey, look, if this thing's found to be a copyright infringement, I have the right to have it destroyed. That's part of my actual right. It's not just that you have to pay me or I can enjoin you from using it for something. I can literally have it destroyed.
That's what it says. That's what Congress wrote. And this is why we have courts look at these and say, what does the statute mean? Does it mean that or not? And this is where, literalist interpretations of law get tricky. I think most people listening to this would agree. Destroying a house seems a little excessive for a copyright copyright violation. Kind of like those FBI warnings that you're going to go to prison for 10 years and have a $250,000 fine.
Yeah, well, and I think the real key thing about this thing here, too, is there's somebody living in the house that didn't build it.
Yeah, somebody bought it. They had no reason to know, and I'm guessing your typical closing contract doesn't include a copyright warranty or indemnity.
It might now.
It probably does now, yeah. Your standard realtor contract probably doesn't. So the court had to figure this out. The buyer, also complicating this, the architect filed what's called a lease pendens notice, which is they go to the county recorder's office and put a lien on the house. Now there's a stain, they say, on the title of the home. Destruction of infringing goods is easy, where you have your typical black market stuff, bootleg copies and things like that. But the question is, what about a house? Can they seize your home? And that's the other thing. You can also impound and seize things. So can someone take my house? Can they have it destroyed? So make your predictions, and we'll come back to that at the end of the episode.
Yep.
Getting down into the weeds on this, Kirk, we've got Yaki.
Again.
Yet another copyright issue somehow.
We need like a little teaser thing to have in our thing whenever we say Yaki or some music clip or something.
Yeah, these are weird issues, and these may seem like isolated cases, but it comes up more than you'd think. In fact, my alma mater that I always mention on the show, University of Iowa, Iowa fans are crazy people, as you probably know from listening to this show, or if you know one in real life, you also know that Kirk is tangentially related to some, so he's familiar with the disease.
Iowa State, actually.
Iowa State, yeah, which is almost worse in some ways. But somebody in Iowa City is remodeling their home to look like the stadium where the Iowa Hawkeyes play, and aside from really irritating his neighbors who have tried to get it enjoined, I think before, there's a question there: is there an architecture right in a publicly owned building like that would be infringed? In theory, could the university enforce that? Now, in this case, probably not, because it's an ancient stadium, so the copyright's probably long since run. Actually, it was built before there was an architecture copyright, so probably not. But in theory or in the abstract, it's a valid question.
And I think it's also worth pointing out in this that you can have copyright in an architectural design. Mm-hmm. You can have it in the blueprint itself, and the idea that the blueprints can't necessarily be copied, but you can potentially get the actual building can end up with a copyright attaching effectively as a work of sculpture.
Yeah.
And I think that's worth noting that it's I think relatively accepted by the courts and the Copyright Office that it is something to do it. The other thing with it is, and I think it's also worth pointing out, it isn't necessarily just even the structure of the building. You can actually get copyright in the facade of the building, and simply its facing or its appearance. So we can look at it and say, okay, it's only the front facing of the building. The back end sort of doesn't have any meaning. So it's worth pointing out that there is copyright in these types of things. We have copyright in architecture. So when we're talking about this, even in the abstract, we're not saying these are things that might be subject to copyright. These are things which are subject to copyright.
Yep.
The question is, what is the scope of that copyright?
And the scope is a tricky question with buildings, especially because you have your competing patent rules that cover functional and useful things, and copyright, by the definition of the copyright statute, cannot cover processes, functions, and useful things.
Yep.
So to the extent that your architecture serves a utilitarian function, those elements of it may not actually be coverable.
Yeah, and this is something the court has to grapple with on a regular basis.
Yeah.
I mean, they grapple with it in fashion and the cheerleading episode or cheerleading case, where what aspects of a cheerleading uniform are functional versus what aspects are ornamental.
Or decorative, yeah.
This is a constant issue they're bumping into in conjunction with copyright because, again, you can only copyright the functional issues. So, again, the fact that the building has a door is probably functional.
Yeah.
Where the door is located, how big it is, what color it is, those kind of things may be considered to be, more expression.
Or maybe even its shape, which we're going to get into when we talk about bag end here in this case. So we're going to compare and contrast two different examples of copyright issues that may arise in the context of buildings, looking at The Simpsons house and Bag End.
Yep.
So let's start with The Simpsons house. If you haven't seen The Simpsons, I don't know how this is possible, but...
how many episodes are they up to? Yeah.
Oh, my gosh, it's been going on forever. I think Simpsons and Meet the Press probably is the oldest, still running.
60 minutes.
So The Simpsons house has a very distinct appearance, color, shape, style. Even the interior layout, I think, is pretty well known at this point. It's all pretty well defined. It's also decidedly silly. Everything is these weird, bright pastel colors.
Yeah, bright pastels.
Like green
That's really the
tables.
things of Simpsons. Yeah, it's all bright pastels.
Well, at some point there was a contest. Somebody built a house modeled on the Simpsons house, and you could win it. And I saw a picture of it before the show. It's hideous. Like nobody would ever want this house. But what's interesting to me about the Simpsons house is that it already has a visual depiction because it's animation.
Yep.
What makes it even more interesting is because it's animation and because animated characters have weird body proportions so that the faces are more expressive and it's easier to make the animation, the animated sets in turn have sort of weird and I'm going to say elastic proportions as needed to serve the particular needs of the plot in any given episode. So if you were to make, as people have, real-life versions of The Simpsons house, I think there's a good argument that there's some element of artistic discretion needed to transform a purely animation depiction of a house that doesn't exist in the real world and perhaps couldn't into one that not only does exist but complies with building codes and a person could actually live in and use and would otherwise be functional. So question number one, if you were to do that, are you infringing anything at all?
Yeah, and I think that is a really difficult question.
Yeah.
Because what we're dealing with is, and again, it's not like we're talking about, hey, you're building something where it was filmed, at a real house.
And we're just recreating the real thing.
Yeah. You're literally copying something which was created by the mind of the author. And we got into this, copywriting of universe previously and these kind of aspects. The Simpsons house is a specific element. Is it a character?
Yeah.
You get into the idea, and there's arguments to say it is. I mean, I think one of the ones that I pick on even more than the Simpsons house. What about Hogwarts?
Yeah.
Hogwarts has a very specific appearance. Or if you really want to get down into, a building that has a specific appearance and well recognized, Cinderella's castle.
Oh, yeah. Which is based on what's that?
Neuschwanstein in Germany. Yeah. It's obviously based upon a German castle, but it looks nothing really like it. It has design elements of it.
More of an inspired by than a copy of.
We're going to get into inspired by at some point in time, but
well, and the other interesting issue, the Simpsons house in the show has only a 2-dimensional animated depiction. If you're building a real house, now you've got to expand it to 3 dimensions, and like I said, there's other design considerations, a lot of which are functional that would go into that. Is there a decent argument that you're not really infringing a copyright at all? And if you are, what is the nature of the copyright? Is it a copyright to a visual work, which is the film, or is there an architecture copyright in the design of the Simpsons house, which would be weird because the house itself, other than the obnoxious colors, is sort of a typical 2-story.
And there's no real blueprint for it or anything like that you sort of get into. And I think that's the thing you get into with these. You also bump into the idea, and I think the fact of the real modification is an important one. And I'm trying to remember, I want to say there was an episode of one show, and for some reason it's Family Guy is jumping to mind, but that may not be what it was, where there's a scene in it where they walk out the same door into different rooms of the house in the same episode repeatedly, and it's done as a joke of the fact that the house cannot physically exist. Because they literally it's the same door leads to every other room in the house. And you kind of get into that. Sometimes that's done as part of the gag. And so when you look at it and say, well, if I wanted to recreate that house, how on earth could you do it?
You could.
And I'm thinking The Simpsons kind of has that because, in the end you have Homer's running from the car. He runs through the door and lands on the couch. But the couch is obviously in the front of the house, not in the rear. And so you have a little bit of that sort of, playing around of exactly where is everything. With it. You also have the issue, and I think that's the other thing to point out, using the idea of the family room and the couch, that scene gets played with in virtually every episode, so it appears different.
It's known as a couch gag now.
Yeah, I mean, and that's the couch gag is sort of unique. When you bump into the couch gag, well, what actually is the appearance of the couch? It's had 300 different appearances, so, including not being there. And so, what do you...
Which is also the joke.
Which is also the joke, yeah. And so, what do you bump into of, what actually is the appearance of that room? That room has hundreds of different appearances.
So let's compare that to a second example, which is I used Bag End because I think our typical listener probably at least is familiar with The Hobbit, if not the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy. But Bag End, if you're not, is the name of the Hobbit hole where Frodo and Bilbo Baggins live in the Lord of the Rings trilogy.
Yeah, it's technically Bilbo's house, if I remember correctly.
And he adopts Frodo when his parents die or something. So we're going to set aside the Peter Jackson films for now because that's one person's licensed depiction of it. But what would be to stop me from making my own completely independent Bag End, which I think people have done. And the reason this is an interesting question to me as compared to the Simpsons example is in the Simpsons, we don't have a narrative description of the house. We have a visual depiction. We know what it's quote-unquote supposed to look like. But for Bag End, we have a narrative description only that is incomplete in a lot of ways. So there's some stuff that if you've read The Hobbit or Lord of the Rings, you know. It's got a round door.
Yep.
The door has a doorknob in the middle. It probably has a lot of gardening and other types of things.
It has grass on the roof.
Has grass on the roof.
Because again, it's essentially partially buried.
Yeah. It has a beer cellar, of course. Things like that. But you can imagine, whereas with the Simpsons house, if I had 5 different people try to make their vision of what it would look like, you could get 5 houses that look generally the same with some minor differences.
Yep.
But they're all going to be recognizable as basically being the Simpsons house.
Yep.
But for Bag End, again, setting aside Peter Jackson, I think if you took 5 different people and said, build this, you could get 5 structures that look very different.
Yeah. And I think you see it as well if you go back to sort of before there were Peter Jackson movies, and I remember this, miniature modelers and stuff who did like miniature trains or did, miniature figures and stuff like that. A lot of them created the Shire, as a place to do it. And I think if you were to go and look at those, there were a lot of questions. And actually one of those that I think is a good example is it's recognized that they are partially buried. They have, sort of grass on the roof. What does it mean to be that? I mean, Peter Jackson's interpretation really kind of builds them into the earth, but you could also build it as it's much more just sort of natural construction, materials. Yes, it sort of grows from the earth, but really built into it. You could also build it as a cave.
Yeah.
And I think that's there's kind of some extremes there as to what it potentially would be, all of which would meet the narrative description.
And what's interesting about this is this kind of goes back to our character copyright episode. If it is an infringement of Lord of the Rings, it's there's going to be no architecture copyright in a narrative description of a fictional structure. I think that's pretty stretched.
Yeah, I think that's really stretched. I mean,
so you'd be arguing that it's an infringement of the work itself in some way. But how attenuated is that?
Well, I think we're getting a character copyright again.
Yeah.
I mean, we're kind of bumping into is the house a character? And now what we're really bumping into is it sufficiently delineated?
Yeah, now we're back to learned hands, indistinctly marked. If Tolkien had described the house in inhumane, painstaking detail,
which he does,
which he kind of
virtually everything.
But imagine, like I can tell you what the weather was for 100 straight years in Middle Earth, and exactly where you will and will not find gnats. But if he'd spent 20 pages laying out all the details of this, would that be distinctly enough marked that Bag End could be considered a character to the point where you could not make any recreation of it, even using a different medium like that? Now, it's a closer issue where you're going to write a book, that would compete directly with Lord of the Rings, same medium, same format, and you're referencing the same thing. But I'm just building something in real life that doesn't say Lord of the Rings, it doesn't say The Hobbit.
And we're talking about a utilitarian structure, too.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily making a piece of artwork that represents this. This is building it as a home.
But somebody who walks up to it's going to say, oh, cool, you made Bag End.
Yeah.
But what's the issue there? The issue is there might be confused into thinking that the Bag End that they found is somehow associated with Tolkien, but that's not copyright's problem.
Yeah, it's not copyright's problem. That's trademark's problem. At the same time, you also bump into it and say, would they really be confused? I mean,
I think there's a strong argument, no.
Yeah.
And if they were, you could put a sign out front that said, we have nothing to do with the estate of Tolkien.
Yeah. But yeah, I think the thing you're really getting into with this, and I think this is what and a lot of what I think is interesting in this, we talked about the idea, and I've talked about the fact that, I'd previously written about the idea of copyright in universe and the idea of, what does it mean? We're talking about things where what we're really seeing here, if there's infringement, is some kind of an infringement of character copyright. That's what it appears to be. And again, because we don't have a visual depiction. Even if we do have a visual depiction, getting back to The Simpsons and those kind of things, arguably it's still covered by character copyright. It's going to be the same basis, at least, as to what's, giving it its grounds. Knowing that we have that, where is that attaching, and how do we get this? Is it sufficiently delineated? We get to, to learned hand, and where do we draw that line?
Well, here's an interesting hypothetical. What if I wanted to make a bar, say?
Yeah.
And I'm going to call it just Ben's Place, but when you walk inside, it's the Mos Eisley Cantina. It's clearly the Mos Eisley Cantina.
Yeah.
Have I infringed anything at that point?
I think, you get some real questions and you get into those. Hey, you made it look like it. Do you have an internal design? what did you copy? Again, you already copied the look of the bar, but
that's different because they had to build the actual set to film on. But if you've ever been on a movie set or even a play set, the sets are often not what they seem on the show. You have partial sets with certain angles that are never completed, so that you can get cameras in and film. Just using out of ceilings, you can get lighting in and that kind of thing. So it's not really a complete set of a bar. It's not a completely finished bar. So, but if I were to take what they do give and finish it, could there be a lawsuit there? And again, the concern is I'm trading off the goodwill Lucas has built up in Mos Eisley as a concept and in Star Wars. That's why people come to my bar, at least in the outset. So now we're into something called initial interest confusion, maybe, where I'm luring people in based on, hey, look, it's a real-life Star Wars bar, but they're not going to be confused into thinking it's somehow associated with Lucasfilm or Disney.
Yeah, I mean, and that's I think the thing, and then you bump into this trademark, is this copyright, what is it? And, it's great to talk about the idea of saying, hey, we've got, the Mos Eisley Cantina. What if I didn't copy the Mos Eisley Cantina? What if I just made a cantina that looks like it would be in the same kind of city as Mos Eisley?
The same general kind of style. Now we're into these trade dress issues we talked about in our first episode. Well, we may get an answer to some of this soon, thanks to a case that was brought to our attention by Ed from ISCA. Let's look at Sabacc, S-A-B-A-C-C.
Yep.
So there's this, if you've seen The Empire Strikes Back, which if you haven't seen it, go see it.
And why are you not listening to this podcast if you haven't seen Empire Strikes Back?
Place. There's a throwaway line near the end where Han and Leia get to Cloud City. We get to meet Lando Calrissian, and Han tells Lando there's something wrong with the Falcon, and Lando says, what have you done to my ship?
Yep.
And Han says, your ship? You lost her to me fair and square. And that's it. So we get this little bit of fluff background about this, there being some tension between these two characters, which is not provided for any reason related to establishing trademark rights or copyright rights. It's just a little narrative element to make us not quite trust Lando and kind of foreshadow that he's up to no good.
Yeah, well, I think it's also the question, it's even been poked at in the extended universe, is he trying to warn Han? Is he trying to warn Han away? What does this have to do with Lando's character? I mean, there's a lot that's read into that scene, quite frankly.
So, we learned Lando used to own the Falcon. He lost it to Han in some kind of game of chance. That's the extent of it. But, you and I were both involved in the extended universe over the years, and as always happens, this one little nugget gets expanded into something else. Yep. And the game is called Sabacc or Sabacc. I don't know how you pronounce it, and probably Lucasfilm doesn't know how you pronounce it either.
Originally.
Yeah. This is probably widely known to your true believer Star Wars fans that Lando lost the Falcon to Han in a game of Sabacc. Well, in 2015, a company in the UK called Ren Ventures made a card game, I think they kickstarted it, called Sabacc or Galactic Sabacc, and the card game uses a Star Wars-like font on the front with the flowing yellow letters. It's got some imagery from the movies. There's the gaffy sticks that the Tusken Raiders use from Tatooine. It's got the Star Wars, the Aurebesh alphabet that Star Wars uses. And in November of 2015, they did something most startups don't think to do. They filed for a federal trademark registration on Sabacc as applied to their card games. And this sailed through. It was not opposed. Normally when you get a trademark, it has to be published once it's allowed, and then anybody who would be aggrieved by the trademark has the chance to come in and say, you shouldn't have that.
It's also important to point out it's also examined by a professional examiner, and that examiner is supposed to look for conflicting trademarks.
Yeah.
So, the United States Patent and Trademark Office found no conflicting trademarks.
Yeah, they found nothing. So the case was allowed, and at some point, Lucasfilm figured out that they did this. And in 2017, May of last year, Lucasfilm filed what's called a cancellation proceeding, which is where they step in and say, hey, this really shouldn't have been issued in the first place, and now it needs to be withdrawn.
Yeah, and a cancellation proceeding is basically because somebody says, hey, for some reason the trademark office screwed up in granting
for whatever reason it was missed. It was missed in the publication period, but nevertheless, these rights should not exist.
Yeah.
Well, Lucas provided quite a bit of evidence in support of that. They pointed out that the word Sabacc had become part of the canon as early as 1980 in books. It was used in a TV program in 1985. Although I read their pleadings, I didn't see what that was. I'm really curious to know what it was in 85 that said that. They looked at the novelization of Empire Strikes Back. It was apparently used there, including some details on the game. They said that it was used in, do you remember the West End games?
RPGs? I played that.
Yeah, we used to play those, and in college, my roommate was the captain of his own YT 1300 stock light freighter, which he called the leap year buzzard, and then he was a big car guy, so he was Han Mopar, and his co-pilot was my friend Ed, not Ed from Iska, different Ed. He was the Wookiee Chimichanga. So.
Yeah, so somebody's been watching too much Christmas special there. Call your Wookiee Chimichanga.
But the West End Games books had a Cloud City rule book that had the Sabacc rules, and it was mentioned in Star Wars Monopoly. And all kinds of things. It was in the card game, too. The collectible card game had, like, Sabacc references in some of the cards. And so anyway, Lucas says Wren Ventures can't register it because Lucas used it first. And that seems like a pretty open and shut case, doesn't it?
Arguably, yes. I mean, the question is did they use it as a trademark?
Yeah. That's what Wren said. They filed for summary judgment in the cancellation proceeding, which is not a lawsuit. It's an administrative proceeding. Yep.
It's at the United States Patent and Trademark Office, so it's like a lawsuit, but it takes place at a federal agency.
But you don't have a federal judge looking at it. The scope of discovery is more limited. It's not like a full-blown lawsuit.
Yep.
So Wren filed for judgment in that case, arguing that Lucasfilm submitted all this material that showed Star Wars being used as a trademark, but didn't show Sabacc being used as a trademark. And this must have spooked Lucasfilm enough because they then filed a federal lawsuit to deal with this, and then sought to have the cancellation proceeding stayed pending the outcome of the lawsuit. And that would have been not the end of it, but that would have been the end of the interesting part of the story for now, because that lawsuit is obviously still going on. It was just filed back in December. Except just last week, Wren Ventures filed a trademark infringement lawsuit against Lucasfilm for the upcoming Han Solo movie, based on a statement by Donnie Glover that the Sabacc game is part of the plot.
Yep. Now, obviously, they haven't seen the movie. It's not shown in the prequels or anything like that, but it's just simply based upon the statement of the actors that it occurs.
So this is the strangest thing. You've got, and it's Wren Ventures, Kylo Ren Ventures in 2015. So this is the strangest situation to me, where they're clearly inspired by, at least, Star Wars. They're making a card game called Sabacc, which is a made-up word by Lucasfilm, and it's Wren Ventures.
By Lucas,
and it's using this imagery, and so now they're saying that this upcoming Han Solo movie is going to confuse people into thinking it's somehow associated with Wren Ventures.
Yeah. Well, and I think the thing you're really getting into with this, and I think this is the thing, is we're arguing about trademark law here.
Yes.
Trademark law is all about likelihood of confusion. And so I think that's in some sense you can see where it's going, which is if we have these two things out, who's confusing who? And really the question is who's entitled to this trademark? I mean, LucasArts is effectively arguing we're entitled to it because we used it first. Wren Ventures is coming back and saying, no, you're not entitled to it because we're the first to use it as a trademark. Mm-hmm. And by the way, we're now both using it as a trademark. It ultimately comes down to this, literally who used it first.
Yeah, I mean, could you not just sign a coexistence agreement and say, we're going to make these card games, we're going to stay out of film and everything else?
Well, you got to wonder, I mean, there's obviously plenty of ways this could settle.
If I'm Lucas, I don't do that. Because I'm not going to send some signal that everybody can start ripping off all these side pieces of our universe.
Yes, but what it makes me think of in conjunction with it is Troops. If you remember Troops, I mean, I'm pretty sure it's unauthorized, but if you haven't seen it, it's a short that's basically done in the style of Cops from back when it was. But
it's really
with Stormtroopers, it's extremely funny. But it ends with a joke, which is effectively a reference to the attack on the Luke's homestead and the Jawas and everything else sort of related to it. And you kind of have that issue: does Lucas really want to encourage anything along these lines? But it's obviously happening of sort of things off the universe.
Well, and historically, Lucasfilm has been pretty hands-off about going after fan stuff. But it's not Lucasfilm anymore calling the shots. It's Disney. Disney's been a little more hands-on with
and this is also
its
clearly
IP.
Not just fan work that's not really for profit or anything like that. This is a for-profit game company, I think, without any question.
Yeah. I mean, they did a Kickstarter and everything else. Well, it's an interesting case because what I find odd is that part of the complaint that was filed by Wren Ventures says that the problem with the Han Solo movie is it is going to mislead people into thinking that Wren Ventures is just playing off the goodwill of Star Wars.
Yeah.
But is that not the case?
Well, I think part of it when we've got into this, quite frankly, is I have the feeling this is we need to get this resolved. Yeah. And what the issue with it is since essentially Disney, LucasArts, Lucasfilm did raise the stakes from this being cancellation litigation into a court proceeding, you've got rent ventures needing to present every possible defense.
This is where we go back to follow the money. We're going to get an answer on this at some point, assuming they don't settle.
They may settle.
Because, and maybe rent ventures is angling for an acquisition or some kind. Who knows what they're trying to accomplish. But, Disney has the vested interest in this Star Wars property they spent an ungodly number of billions of dollars to acquire.
Yeah.
And so, of course, they're going to protect it. And so, maybe it's not so much that the outcomes follow the money, but the cases that have outcomes follow the money.
And the good thing about it, I think, what we have with it, quite frankly, this is a strange situation, but it is also a very good set of facts to get at some of these issues. And I think that's the thing that I can look at with this, because we do have a true sort of throwaway line that's the famous part. Mm-hmm. We have it coming into an expanded universe with not really any description. So we've really got this idea of what is this trademark use. Yeah. And we've got not a product that just simply happens to be using the name, but what is clearly supposed to be referencing the product. It's the same thing.
The one thing I did not see Disney assert, maybe they will at some point, was I wonder if there's any strength to the argument that Sabacc as applied to a card game is just plain not trademarkable because it's just the name of the card game, like poker or solitaire.
Yep.
It's just the name of this game in the universe, and so it's inherently descriptive and not trademarkable. Just like Java is the name of a language, England is the name of a country.
Yeah.
You can't use it as a trademark to describe a country or programming language. Likewise, could you not say you can't use Sabacc to describe a card game? It's just the name of the game.
Yeah, I think you potentially get into that, though. Something I think you want to. I think you bump into the, hey, it's a card game you've created. You potentially want to have it. Again, maybe we're getting into a little bit of a follow the money type of question, but I think the thing you really get into there is it's what can of worms does that open?
Yep. Well, let's go back to our cases that started all this out. The 5 Points case. The outcome was the graffiti artist won, and the court found not only that the works were of the required recognized stature, but that the building owners acted willfully and maliciously in painting over them, and so the court applied the maximum statutory penalty under the Copyright Act of $150,000 per work. Now, there were over 11,000 works of art on this building, but only a small handful, a couple dozen, were found to have the sufficient stature to merit protection. So, still, that said, a couple dozen graffiti artists were awarded $6.5 million in a verdict.
In a verdict. Now, whether or not they get paid is another question entirely.
Yeah, and so this is the part that's going to be the salacious thing that shows up on your Facebook page. Graffiti artists spray someone's building, and then they're owed $7 million for having it painted over. There are procedures that will deal with this. There's an appeal. There'll be, you can do a remitter after the fact and say, we'll agree not to appeal if you knock it down to $100,000.
The thing I think is really interesting here, though, and it's the comment that you just made, is it was a relatively small percentage of actual works that were found to have the required level, recognizing that there probably are even more works that have been painted over in the course of this. You really got a question here of, and if you're the building owner, when does something rise to this level? Yep. I mean, you've looked at it and said, they won the vast majority of these.
And the lesson is don't just let people draw on your buildings, and then come in later. And part of what motivated this too was how this went down. Like the works were painted over in the middle of the night. Like there's a lot of things that happened that just made it seem like it was sort of malicious and mean spirited, which may have motivated the judge's outcome. So that's that case. The other one, the Michigan case. The court said there's no authority to support the idea that Section 503 will allow you to seize or destroy a house. So sanity prevails. They said it applies to movable goods only. And even more interesting, the lawyers who advanced this argument in that case had already tried it once before and been shot down. So this court found that other case, which the lawyers did not tell them about, even though you're supposed to do that. And not only did they not order the house to be knocked down, they ordered sanctions. They required the attorneys doing this to pay the legal fees of the homeowners and allow the homeowners to file a counterclaim for slander of title. So
effectively, the lien was done maliciously against the title.
Yeah. So that case also sanity prevailed. So there you go. Well, compare that to your own notes and see how things came out. Okay, we have mail, although not that much today. The first one is a 2-word response I got that said "you're primitive," which I believe is in response to the Black Panther review we did, where I had characterized, forget what I said, but characterized the Central African cultures as compared to the European cultures as primitive. So that was probably a poor choice of words on my part, so mea culpa. But the point was that you've got Wakanda is like the paragon of technological advancement and civilization, as contrasted to Europe, which is supposed to, I think, be like an object lesson in how Europe is contrasted to the more rural parts of the world.
Yep.
And doesn't change the fact that it's an awesome movie.
It's still an awesome movie, yes.
Okay, the next one. What did you guys think of Oil States? Kirk, what was Oil States?
So Oil States is the case that just went to the Supreme Court. Decision just came down as to whether or not the AIA, the case, the
American Invents
Act, which modified the patent law and created IPR, inter partes review, and a lot of the after review procedures of the Patent Office, which are being used to challenge patents, whether or not that was a constitutional procedure. So that was the case that went down. Decision did just come down. It did just find that it was a constitutional procedure. They can institute these types of proceedings.
Yep.
My basic take of it, and I think the interesting takeaway is I kind of look at it and say I'm not sure the other outcome was possible, just because I think the disruption would have been so dangerous from it.
It's also the nature of the basis for the claim. So there's an argument that patents are private property rights and that you have to have a regular Article III court take those rights away. You can't just do it through the patent office. But I read the case when it came down, and I thought the court clearly left a door open to argue that it may be unconstitutional on other bases like due process and things like that.
And I think that's the thing. What my prediction for Oil States had basically been that I figured they would find it either constitutional but leave a door open for a potential other challenge to say there's problems with it, or find it unconstitutional but point out what would make it constitutional. Yep. I really had the feeling they were going to kind of walk the fine line. I did think it was interesting we did have a 2-judge dissent.
Roberts and Gorsuch.
And they very clearly sort of stated, hey, look, this is effectively a taking, that they saw it as being the loss of the right. It's an interesting case. It's one of these that I think is, quite frankly, going to show up in administrative law case books for the next 100 years.
It's going to be litigated again. They're going to keep challenging these procedures.
Yep.
I also had forgotten to mention, we got a shout-out on Twitter from the Bioentrepreneurship Core Group at Washington University here in St. Louis. I know their coordinator, Luke, and he had me give a talk to their folks a while back, and I'd mentioned the podcast. So if any of you from BioCore are here and listening in, welcome, and thank you very much for tuning in. I believe, Kirk, Stuart Keating over at Earthbound. Stuart's doing their next talk on how to have a successful business without breaking the law or being a jerk.
Which very fits much his personality.
Yes, it does. All right. Well, that's it for today. There's the music, and it is time for us to move along. If you have questions, comments, or topic ideas, you can send your thoughts to us on Twitter at LGGPod or email us at lggpodcast@gmail.com. You can also talk to us on our Facebook page. Search for A Lawyer's Guide to the Galaxy, and you will find us there. You can subscribe to this podcast. Find us on iTunes, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Podbean, or wherever you get your podcasts. Someone asked if we're on Spotify. I think we're not, but we're getting there.
We're trying to get there, yep.
So we will be soon. If you like what you hear, please give us a review. We really appreciate those. It helps other people find us. You can find me on Twitter at Benjamin Siders, and Kirk is at KirkDMN. Next time, we're going to finally circle back to the law of autonomy and AI and get into some detail on things like driverless cars, AI, botnets, and this actually we think plays into blockchain a little bit too. And the genesis of this discussion is the smiling monkey photo.
The monkey selfie.
Yeah, which I think the Ninth Circus just had a ruling on. So, and then we'll also next time do our Han Solo movie predictions. So that's all for today. We will see you next time. Lorem, play us out.
The views expressed by the participants of this program are their own and do not represent the views of, nor are they endorsed by Lewis Rice LLC, its officers, directors, employees, agents, representatives, shareholders, and subsidiaries. None of the content should be considered legal advice. As always, consult a lawyer. This podcast was produced and recorded at Cool Fire Studios in St. Louis, Missouri.